Hello everybody, this is Pine, a game whose main conceit is that you are a human in a world where humans are really not all that important, which is the sort of store page description that immediately caught my eye because that's fairly interesting, the idea that humans are not top of the food chain, that you are not all that prolific in this world and there are other beings that are much more important in it and you are going to have to sort of ingratiate yourself to them in order to actually be safe. It's not all that common, even in fantasy settings and things like that, that humans aren't very, very powerful, either like a kingdom or an empire, and have a lot of influence in the surface of the world. But in this case, they are almost unheard of, almost mythological, in fact, to some, and really not that important in the current day. And your task is to, well, to be honest, the game actually reminds me a little bit of Horizon Zero Dawn in the beginning. Not in gameplay, the gameplay is very different, but in the general story and how it's presented at first, the idea is that you are someone who lives in a very sort of exclusionary society, humans at the top of this big, dangerous cliffside, and it seems that they're used to living there all the time. They have lived there for as long as anyone can remember, and it's not really a great place because it constantly falls down and destroys things, and it's just fairly dangerous. But everyone there is afraid of everything outside of this cliffside. The whole world to them is a surface filled with mysteries and danger and not a place that they would like to go. Basically, it's forbidden to go there. However, your character is one of the only ones that actually believes that there may be something out there for you. There may be something else in the world that is better than here. And you set out, despite the unhappiness of your fellow villagers, to find out what else is out there. And like I said, that's very similar to like the very beginning of Horizon, the way that the initial sort of tribe feels about everything. But it opens up into this pretty interesting game that is, I will go ahead and say from the outset, heavily flawed. This is a very imperfect game. But for some reason, as I'm playing it, every time I got frustrated or sort of confused about some of the mechanics, there was another mechanic or another thing that happened just around the corner that made me want to keep playing. It is one of those kinds of games that reminds me of something that would come out in like the early 2000s era, by which I mean games like Giants, Citizens Kabuto, and Sacrifice, for instance. Games that have very odd combinations of mechanics and sort of like a genre mashup that wouldn't normally be considered a safe thing to do. Like how Giants was kind of like an RTS slash third-person shooter, and Sacrifice was like a sort of strategy RTS third-person RPG. They were just very different. They were odd combinations of things that we haven't really seen much of since, unfortunately. And this game is one of those. It's one of those games that has some really janky mechanics and some weird stuff to it, but also is kind of fascinating in how it applies them. And in my opinion, although is somewhat frustrating at times, in terms of not always getting the things that it wants to do right, it does enough right to still be interesting and actually worth playing if you're into, well, basically if you're up for like a third-person exploration. This game is very heavily exploration focused. There is combat, however, it is by far the worst part of the, well, it's tied for the worst part of the game because it's basic, it's very simple, and it just kind of does the job. It feels like it's there because it has to be and is really something that you're kind of trying to avoid, which is unfortunate because there is a fair bit of like gear variety that you can craft, lots of weapons to make, and some other usable items like explosive barrels and tripwires and stuff like that that imply that the combat has a bigger role, but really it's something that you don't want to do too much because it's pretty clunky, it's very slow, and often somewhat unresponsive, especially in the idea that you have a dodge. The dodge works basically just like the dodge from Bloodborne, in that if you single tap it, you sort of dash in the direction you are facing, or if you double tap it, you roll. But the dodge is not all that useful, in my opinion, because it is heavily delayed. Mostly because the attack animation seems to basically be like exclusive to itself for a long time, by which I mean once you hit attack, you're committed to that attack for the next like minute and a half, because as the swing animation happens, there will be a long period of time between like swinging, finishing swinging, and then being able to dodge or do anything else. It's a very like, it's weighty is not the word. Weighty would imply there's some like satisfaction in terms of like impact. It's not weighty, it's just clunky and kind of feels like you're fighting in jelly. Everything is very slow and takes a long time to respond. So the combat is definitely something that I would recommend avoiding as much as possible. Unfortunately, there are lots of things that you will need to use it for, especially gathering things like tokens, which you use for crafting specific other bits that help to influence the island. But really, let's get into the really interesting, main, meaty part of the game, and in terms of all that. The island is filled with other races, as I mentioned. The races are there are 5 of them, and they're all very different. They have different cultures, different ways of fighting, different architectural styles, different everything, and they're actually pretty interesting. There are, by far, the most interesting part of the game is how it treats these races, their histories, and their cultures and things. It's kind of fascinating, actually. It's a really cool aspect. And there are villages, settlements, all over this island that you're on, and each one will belong to one of the various species. And there will also be a capital city for each species that they will always try and defend much harder than any other area. You know, you can actually have a bit of a dynamic war going on where they will fight each other for land, and they'll actually try and take each other's cities and things. But if a capital city is taken, it will become quite a territorial fight, as the original owners of that capital will try and constantly take it back, and sort of like a war of attrition, just throwing people at it until they can get it back because it's their capital. They want to keep it, which is pretty interesting. And this is where the double-edged sword comes in of you being a human means you're not all that important in the world, which is fascinating in one side of the sword, because it's really interesting to see this political strife and everything going on that doesn't really involve you. You are not that important, and you can influence it from the outside, but you are not a member of these races, so you are more of an observer than any sort of like major player in it for a long time. The other side of that is sometimes it feels like the island changes hands so many times and so much can happen when you're not around that it almost feels like you would rather be playing one of them because it would be more interesting. There are moments where it's really interesting that you're not the focus, and there are moments that seem like they would be significantly more interesting if you were the focus because of how quickly things can change at an almost frustrating pace, to the point where oftentimes the map is not accurate. The map will, if you hover over a settlement, will tell you who owns it, but things change hands so quickly when you're not around that almost every time I open the map, it's wrong. At least 1 or 2 of the settlements will have a wrong label on it and be telling me that someone owns it that doesn't anymore. And you can always tell because there's a fast travel system, and you cannot fast travel to a settlement that you are not friends with, which makes sense. If the race that owns it is hostile to you, you would be traveling into a big, like, horrible situation, so it makes sense that you can't do that. But sometimes you'll hover over a settlement that says it's owned by a faction that is hostile to you. However, the fast travel button will still pop up, meaning that if you were to actually fast travel, you will see that in fact it is owned by someone completely different that you are actually friends with. The map is frequently wrong in terms of who owns what areas. And this is really where those like early 2000s interesting genre blending mechanics come into play. Each settlement has a tower in the middle of it, or near the center-ish, that has a flame above it, and the number of flames tells you how advanced the settlement is. The more population it has, the more it's able to grow, the more materials and food it has to get more population and better arm themselves and things. It will continue to get bigger. The houses will upgrade one by one and become more impressive looking depending on who owns it, and eventually this tower will recede into the ground and come back up with an extra flame, anywhere from 1 to 3, 3 being the absolute top tier, like highly advanced version of that race's settlement. And if you just walk near this tower, you'll see little meters will pop up that tell you how much of each resource they have, population, food, and materials, and you can actually trade with them in order to help them out. And this is definitely the most interesting part of the whole thing, all this sort of settlement management, the idea that you are an influencer but not an owner. You can do things to help or hinder these races, but they are still very much doing things on their own even without you, which is fascinating, actually. And it involves, as you can see in the background here, I'm friends with the Fexel, which are a alchemy-obsessed fox race, which are pretty amazing, and I have a raid flare with them that allows me to call them in to raid a settlement that they don't own, so they can take it and expand their influence. And I decided that I wanted to raid this one because it's part of a quest, and to try out the whole raid system because it's the first time I actually got to access it. And it's pretty cool. It works exactly as you would think. You plop down this raid flare and they will come in from a nearby settlement, and how many of them there are and how well armed they are depends on the nearby settlement's level and how much material and population they have and stuff, which is really cool. It makes it a lot more dynamic so that a very well armed race can actually, you know, go through a large number of settlements and actually take them over, well, whereas if you try and get a raid going from like a very anemic outpost that barely has any people in it yet, it won't really be that effective. You can do things like find these donation boxes outside of settlements in order to sort of ingratiate yourself with the race by allowing you to trade them things to make them neutral or friendly with you, which is of course necessary because you can't get into their settlements if they hate you because they'll all attack you. And so that makes sense. And there's also traders inside of settlements that will trade with you if you are friendly. And the higher the tech level of the settlement, the more advanced stuff they have. And they will even have race-specific armor and weapon crafting materials and ideas, which are blueprints for you. There's a pretty large crafting system in the game. You can craft all sorts of things, which is definitely pretty cool. And you know, there's like racial armors and weapons. There's other things that you can find here and there that will help you out, like arrows, various kinds. As you progress through the game, you'll also find these not so physical items that you can craft. They are like treaties and stuff like that, like peace treaties, things that efficiency plans, which will make any settlement that you trade or donate it to much more efficient for 5 minutes. They'll like gain a lot more food and resources and stuff, and it's a very good thing to use if you want to up the tech level of one of them. You can also find sabotage versions of those things, like, you know, a sabotage plan, which is basically the opposite of an efficiency plan. It will make things weaker. You can trade poisoned meat to make the warriors of a nearby settlement much weaker, so that if you want to raid them, it'll be a lot easier on you. Stuff like that. You can even have these other types of plans that will cause them to do specific things, so you can help to control what exactly the NPCs are actually going to do, like stockpiling certain types of materials and equipment, if you want, for maybe because, you know, there could be a raid coming, or because they just took an area and it's pretty small right now, so you want them to like hurry up and make a whole bunch of weapons and armor and stuff for their guards so that it's easily defendable. It's really neat, and I really like the idea of the system. I think it works really, really well. Like I said, it is a bit of a double-edged sword, and that sometimes all this stuff can happen without your permission as well, which I like, but is also sometimes difficult to square when, you know, you have like whole areas that can change hands like 3 times in the time that you've been gone, because everything happens so quickly without you sometimes. It's a cool system overall, though, and I think that the game is definitely better for its inclusion, and that's the thing that really reminds me of an older game. You know, like a PS2 era game, when these sort of genre mashups were more common, and I think it's a really cool idea that they've actually implemented fairly well. Even though it has its problems, it is overall a positive aspect. To be honest, though, the main problems I actually have with the game aren't necessarily the mechanics, because although they are flawed, they're still very interesting and fun to interact with. It's just the polish. The overall polish of the game leaves something to be desired sometimes. I mentioned that the combat is very clunky, and really clunky is how I would describe a lot of aspects of the game outside of this really interesting settlement management system. One of the biggest problems I have really is the UI. If you look at the UI, just as a couple of examples, for instance, you'll see in the top left a little thing that says LB, like the left bumper on a controller. That is your food slot. You need food to, you have a sort of like a Harvest Moon style stamina system, which works fairly well. There's nothing really wrong with it. You can hold LB to select food, and tap it to eat the food, which is fine. That works just fine. As you can also see, though, maybe, there's also a little tiny white number next to that food icon, and it's really hard to see. That tells you how much of that food you have left, which is a very important information, but it's white, and the background is also like a sort of off-white, so it makes the number really, really hard to read. And that's just one kind of small example of the fact that the user interface seems to sometimes be designed in a strange way. Other examples of this, the inventory and crafting menu are just big lists that can't be sorted, which is kind of unfortunate, especially because certain materials can only stack up to certain amounts, so it's hard to see how many of one material you have sometimes, because the stacks can be all over your inventory instead of in a nice row, because you can't sort them. Also, the map is weird. The map, I mentioned that you can hover over settlements, and it will tell you who owns them and what level they are, what tech level they are from C to A. Although sometimes it gets who owns them currently wrong, but still, that is the only thing on the map that actually has hover over information. All the other symbols, like caves and stuff like that, if you hover over them, it doesn't show anything. So if you're trying to remember where a certain place is, you kind of just have to go there, because the nothing has labels. And that also is the case with quest markers. If you're tracking multiple quests at once and you don't know which marker is for which, you just have to disable all the markers except for the one that you want to see, because if you hover over the markers on the map, it doesn't tell you the name of the quest or anything. So that's just another example of the map being just not really giving you enough information at times. The UI in this game as a whole is just kind of weird sometimes. It feels like things are too clunky, or clunkier than they should be. Like deploying stuff like explosive barrels uses the food menu for some reason, so you have to like replace your food with a usable item like an explosive barrel or a tripwire, then deploy it, then switch back to your food. It's kind of weird. Like I said, it's not the biggest deal ever, but it is clunkier than it needs to be. Overall, though, I enjoyed my time with Pine, and I have to give it a tentative recommendation because it's interesting. The story focuses on the history of these other species and humans on the island and beyond, and what has happened in the past. The art style is pretty nice, and the overall personality that the game has, especially with some of the other races and the way that they speak to you and things, is actually pretty funny, and it is genuinely well done in terms of its overall atmosphere. And I will give the recommendation in the case that you really want something to explore. This is a game that requires exploration. This is not a game that you can put a small amount of time in and feel like you have achieved a lot. It's not one of those games that you can play in short bursts. It's a slow burner. You need to put in quite a bit of time to get something out of it, because the way the quests work, you often have to do several main quests to access new parts of the game. Like, for instance, the raid mechanic, all the various treaties you can do, the upgrading from like tier 1 to 2 and 3, all of these take time. These are things that you have to unlock the ability to have happen by doing the main quest. And also finding the various things like you're seeing in the background right now that allow you to explore more of the world have to be done, you know, one at a time between large sections of like quest line. So it's a game that has a lot of problems. It's a game that is very imperfect, but it's a game that has a pretty interesting conceit to it, the whole, like, you know, humans aren't that important thing, and it has a lot to explore. And because it focuses on the exploration as its main aspect, that means that I can still recommend it, honestly, if you want something to explore, because, you know, if it was trying to focus on its combat or something, then I would have to say give it a pass, because its combat isn't very good, but that's not really what you're there for. You're there to explore the world, find new ways to interact with things, interact with these villages and other races, and all this stuff, and that aspect is the strongest part of the game. So what it tries to do, for the most part, it succeeds in, and that makes it, in my opinion, worth playing if you're up for a slow-burning, sort of exploration-focused action-adventure. It's also $25, which is a bit steep in my opinion because of the some of the problems that it has. The camera is also a bit buggy. For instance, it likes to sort of embed itself in hillsides when you're fighting. Really just locking on when fighting in general is kind of a mistake because it makes the camera go all wonky. So I would say maybe wait for a sale. But if you are a fan of games like this, if you like the idea of the kind of weird early 2000s genre bending stuff that is actually pulled off pretty well, and if you are a fan of exploration and you want an interesting world to actually just see, then you could definitely do a lot worse than Pine. Overall, it's a pretty cool game for what it sets out to do, and I have to appreciate it tackling a not very safe idea, you know, something that you haven't seen a bunch, and actually pulling it off, for the most part, pretty well. So that is Pine. The link is in the description below this video. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.